Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar on Global Supplier Payment Operation Trends, brought to you by Gatepoint Research and Tipalti. If you can hear me, congratulations. It means you successfully set up your speakers. If you can see the presentation, just sit back and enjoy the discussion. If you're having trouble with either of these, please message the chairperson on the chat window and I'll try to resolve it for you. Speaking of the chat window, that's where you can submit any questions about the content of the presentation. Rob and Doug will answer them at the end of the webinar. Thank you, and without further ado, here's Rob Israq.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into the key processes from our study with Gatepoint Research that they conduct on the state of today's global supplier payment processes. My name is Rob Israq. I'm Chief Marketing Officer at Tipalti, and joining me today is Doug Barth, co-founder and principal analyst at Gatepoint Research. So Tipalti sponsored the survey because we work with hundreds of AP departments to help them make payments to over about 1 million suppliers right now. And given this unique perspective, we are seeing a general trend of increased complexity and inefficiencies and risk related to managing payments to suppliers in the U.S. and overseas. The entire process of paying suppliers can be very time-consuming and rife with error. But it's also something that people haven't really spent a lot of time reevaluating because it's a process that's always been done the same way for multiple decades. So we embarked on the study and worked with Gatepoint Research because we wanted to know how big a pain is this today. What areas within the process of managing supplier payment operations are most problematic? How satisfied are companies with today's current approach to managing supplier payment operations, and how are they getting it done? Where can companies improve their processes and optimize their processes? So in terms of how the study was conducted, between February and May of 2016, Gatepoint Research invited selected financial executives to participate in the survey. The survey was specifically focused on global payment operations and the trends in the space. Candidates were invited via email. About 100 executives, mostly finance, participated. I'll go through some of the breakdowns of the firmographics in more detail in following slides. But survey participants represented firms from a wide variety of industries, as well as a wide variety of annual revenue trends as well. I'll run into a few of those specific details now. So in terms of revenue, it was a good split across the economy. Generally speaking, though, the survey was biased a little bit more upmarket to fast-growing, mid-sized, and large enterprises in terms of who responded. As you probably know on the phone, the U.S. economy, 90% of the U.S. economy is made up of more mom-and-pop small businesses, and those folks didn't respond to the survey quite as much. I think the reason being is the complexity of supplier payments does not get that large or painful when you're a very small company. Maybe you're only processing 30 payments a month or the such. Once you start hitting 50, 100, 200, 1,000 payments a month, that process starts getting very painful and time-consuming. And those are the folks that were more interested in participating in this survey and getting insights into the trends in the space. In terms of the breakdown by industry, as you can see, a wide variety of industry, many business services, which that percentage of 29% in terms of businesses is about the percentage in the U.S. economy that call themselves services businesses, but a wide variety of other companies as well. And certainly a lot of senior folks, directors, VPs, and CXOs participate in the study. Again, I think the reality is that accounts payable and supplier payments, they have implications far beyond just finance, and that's why we saw a lot of senior folks participating in the survey. If a company relies heavily on your suppliers to deliver your products and goods, a poor payment experience can really lead to serious issues around your supplier relationships and your ability to retain those folks who are key to your supply chain and your product and service experience. The payment experience within that is probably the most important touch for those suppliers. So managing this process poorly can really hurt those relationships in the future. An inefficient process to suck away resources for more high-value strategic projects finance can lead. and hinder a company's ability to grow efficiently and quickly. Let's say a company wants to grow globally or increase their supplier base globally. If you don't have an AP process that can withstand that and handle that efficiently, it really holds back your company. So I think for that reason we saw a disproportionate amount of high-level executives participating in the survey, because it affects finance at all levels, but it also affects other departments if accounts payable and supplier payments are not run efficiently. Next up, okay, thank you for joining us, Doug. So just to refresh your memories, folks on the phone, on the webinar, thank you for your patience. So Doug is the chief analyst at Gatepoint Research, and they were the firm that conducted the study. So Doug, I have taken the group through page 4 of the presentation. We're currently on page 5. How many payments do you send to your suppliers per month? So if you could start running the takeaways from here.
Sure. So we asked the question of the group of selected executives, how many payments do you send to suppliers each month? And look at this. It's kind of surprising how it's skewed to doing a lot. 76% make more than 100 payments per month, and 45% actually send over 500 per month. So it's a very high volume.
Doug, was there any indication that the number of employees at the company correlate with payment volume?
You know, it doesn't seem to be a factor. Even small companies reported that they made a large number of payments.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'd imagine for smaller companies, the higher volume would actually be even more painful and a greater issue. Right now, the way most companies contend with this, the volume of supplier payments, invoices, and the such, is to hire more finance and AP staff. The process gets done, but doesn't get done in a better or more efficient way. Certainly not in a way that scales with economies as your company grows. So we'll go to the next slide.
Next, in terms of business goals, we asked respondents what are some of their organization's goals over the next 12 to 18 months. And very revealing, don't you say, Rob?
Yeah, you know, I knew it was critical, but frankly, I was a little surprised that tax and regulatory requirements had jumped to number 1. In the past, when we've done these studies, we've seen streamlining and scaling AP and supplier payments as the strong number 1. And of course, it's in the top 3 still, but tax and regulatory compliance has now jumped to number 1, which is really interesting. The top 3, to me, make a lot of sense based on our own interactions with our customers. On tax and regulatory compliance, this has traditionally been an afterthought in the past, which is why I was a little surprised to see it jump to number 1. But maybe with, you know, the new FACTA tax compliance regulations and the pretty severe penalties related to that, as well as increased scrutiny over AML and OFAC checking and requirements from the federal government, compliance has become a major concern for finance and AP departments to reduce risk of fines, penalties, or business disruption. So that perhaps is what's causing that. You know, with the new FACTA IRS reporting requirements, the onus is now being put on the payer, not the payee, to do this process right and manage it right. It's not good enough anymore for the payer to just collect tax forms even. They have to validate that the right form was collected, that the right information was collected. Then they have to withhold taxes when necessary from the payments to suppliers. You've got 1099, 1042S reporting, which is becoming increasingly difficult. So there's definitely increased complexity and risk there. And then AML checking enforcement, or many companies in the U.S. think of it as OFAC requirement checking. But AML stands for anti-money laundering. And it's definitely the scrutiny there from the federal government is on the rise with risk of terrorism, money laundering, fraud, and the such. So companies really have to kind of keep it top of mind now. So I think that's what we're seeing there.
Rob, did I hear right that the tax compliant element is now on the payer?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Essentially what happened is the IRS realized they can't easily collect money from the supplier, and so they're putting the onus on the payer instead. And so they're putting all the response on the payer to make sure that they've collected the forms, that they made sure that the payer has given the payee has given the payer the right form, and they're actually validating on the form. And so this is all kind of covered under the FACTA requirements, or the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. It really rolls off the tongue. And as for supplier payments, we definitely see this as customers, in terms of streamlining supplier payments. They're essentially looking to reduce the amount of time their finance organization spends managing the minutiae related to AP and supplier payments. So much of the process is manual today and prone to data entry errors. Everything from accepting and coding up invoices, verifying bank information, setting up payments, commuting payment status to suppliers, reconciling payment data. It's really just not what a finance person is meant to be doing. Finance folks are highly talented analytical folks, and unfortunately that's how accounts payable has evolved over time.
I can feel that pain too. I'm a business owner myself, and that's the kind of day-to-day headache that I'd really rather not think about.
Yeah, you and probably just about everyone in a senior management position of any sort. What it comes down to is the initiative to scale your company for growth. And so the companies we work with, a lot of them have real business aspirations to grow, grow aggressively in the future, and they want to dedicate their talent to accelerating that growth, expanding across borders, differentiating their service, and certainly improving efficiencies across their business as they grow. Unfortunately, they're having to spend increasing amounts of time on repeatable processes like supplier payments, which kind of holds them back from focusing on more strategic opportunities.
On the next question here, we asked the group about onboarding new suppliers. So we dove deeper into the individual supplier payment processes. We asked them about onboarding new suppliers. This is a process where a supplier's details are captured, such as their banking information, tax information, contact information. And as anticipated, there's quite a bit of manual effort involved. And so we saw, when you add up kind of the top two slices there, 79% of this is happening over email or through some sort of dialogue with the supplier. I guess part of that would introduce big security concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Security, definitely, sending payment data via email is probably not the best thing to do for your own company from a fraud perspective, as well as on behalf of your suppliers. So there's definitely security, which is an increasing concern. There's just also the complexity and compliance. We talked about security of the email itself, that data, of course, not being encrypted and controlled. But as for complexity, there's 26,000 rules related to global remittance, and varieties of different requirements related to SWIFT or IBAN or ABA rounding numbers and the such. And expecting a human being to know all these different thousands of rules by different country, by different payment method, etc., you're just setting yourself up for errors in the process that will cause payment issues for your suppliers. They cost real money in terms of bank fines and penalties, and they certainly don't make a good impression with your suppliers. So what we generally stress there is a need for a supplier portal that is self-service for your suppliers to keep it up, and essentially puts the onus and the responsibility for updating accurate payment information on your supplier, rather than on finance to data enter and collect information from your suppliers. And then there's the finger pointing game between who made the error. Put everything on the supplier. They know that if they make an error, they're not going to get paid. It takes finance out of the conversation of, oh, you did it wrong, or I did it wrong, and the such. So we found that this dramatically really kind of streamlines the process, but also improves the access. What I'm referring to by supplier portal is kind of the concept of having a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week kind of web-based resource that can intelligently guide the supplier to collect the right information they needed. The supplier ends up getting value out of that tool, of course, because they're able to select the payment method they want, the currency they want, see their payment history, see their payment status, update payment information as they want, upload information like tax forms or invoices. But from a finance team's perspective, the payer end, it definitely increases efficiency and decreases payment errors quite significantly.
I'd say it's disappointing that so few payers offer that option.
Yeah, I think the reason is it's not that easy yourself. It requires a lot of knowledge of global remittance rules. There's 26,000 rules I mentioned before. If you do it right, you're supposed to embed those rules into that supplier onboarding, so you're proactively avoiding these errors before they happen. And of course, then it makes you, if you build it yourself, you have to rely on an IT person, not only to build it, but then to maintain it. And that includes maintaining all these rule changes across essentially each country in the world. Think something like Brexit. As soon as Brexit happens, that changes many of these rules regarding remittance as it relates to the UK. And someone needs to be on top of that and updating these portals to have that logic built in there and the intelligence. So otherwise, it's more or less just lipstick on a pig. And at the end of the day, you collect that information, just pass someone else to do the data entry work all over again, and you're just pushing the can down the road, so to speak. So.
Yeah, so the takeaway would be, I guess, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's take a look at some of the details of onboarding, which seems to be a critical first step in the payment process. So in this question, we asked the respondents on the survey about how much time per week they spend just on onboarding. You can see less. Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think most people would look at the chart and say that's not so bad. A good chunk of these folks are spending less than 3 hours a week.
Yeah, it looks that way, and that's what we thought. But then we dug a little deeper into it, and we focused the results of this just on those people who claimed to be onboarding more than 50 suppliers per month. We just looked at that segment. And on this next pie chart, you can see for those, just focusing on those respondents who onboarded more than 50 suppliers a month, the onboarding time really jumped up significantly, with about 67% spending more than 4 hours a week, and almost half, 47%, spending more than 6 hours a week. So over a month, that adds up to between 16 and 24 hours, respectively.
Yeah, that's a significant number for sure. Even if you do some basic math, but if you take the assumption a full-time employee makes about $80,000 a year, all in, you're looking at spending about somewhere between $7,500 and $11,000 a year to onboard suppliers. So that's a pretty significant cost. And I'm guessing that even if you did that, you likely are not probably incorporated best practice onboarding processes around validation of the supplier and collection of tax information and the such to reduce payment errors and risks. So the other thing to consider is as your company grows, your supplier base is going to grow, and that problem you have today with these hours spent are only going to increase over time.
So on the next question on the survey, we focused on the different payment methods the company used to pay their suppliers. So the question was, what forms of payment does your organization manage?
Yeah, I mean, we can add a little perspective on this question of, why we thought it was important. We asked this because most finance teams they try to expand their payment options. Generally, finance folks and accounts payable professionals, there's a big initiative across the space to shift towards electronic payment methods to help prevent fraud. The manual payment methods like check by far are the most fraud exposed. Secondly, depending on your business model, there's a lot of movement towards offering more payment methods because suppliers demand it, particularly overseas suppliers. But unfortunately, while you expand payment options to prevent fraud and to also accommodate supplier needs, there is complexity that comes along with that. As your supplier base gets more global, suppliers in each region tend to have different payment preferences and needs. There's different information that also has to be collected by each country, and some will also want local currency to be accepted. So having too limited a selection of payment methods may also limit your company's ability to expand and attract a vibrant partner and supplier network.
Yeah, we can see on this that the top three methods by far, paper checks, wire transfers, and US ACH, are very commonly used by the respondents. They're the leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are the tried and true methods. In general, of those three, US ACH is definitely the trending method. It's the most secure, it's the most cost effective, and it's much more protected of fraud as opposed to checks and even wire. Wires have a benefit in they're fast, and they do have pretty strong controls, particularly relative to check. And you're certainly confident that the payment is going to happen with them. But they're very expensive, sometimes in the range of $10 to $15 to $20 a shot. If you're paying 500 people a month through wire, that's really pricey. Another, paper checks have serious issues related to fraud. I think that anyone on the phone or on the webinar can do a quick search in Google, but the risk of fraud exposure from a check is by far the highest of all the different payment methods. It's also very labor intensive as well. Most analysts estimate that the average cost of processing a check is in the $15 range when you look at all the various fees, costs, and time related to it.
Yeah, and clarify if you could, Rob, ACH, that's direct deposit?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, we're in the payment space, so sometimes we'll use acronyms, not realizing that not everyone knows this at the back of their hand. But yeah, ACH stands for Automated Clearinghouse. It's essentially a direct payment into domestic bank accounts. And the biggest challenge there is just that the supplier needs to provide that ACH data in order to process it. But it's very inexpensive. It's very controlled from a fraud perspective. It certainly moves your payment methods to an efficient place. That's electronic, and that also is a better experience generally for the supplier. But the limitation here is that when people refer to ACH, they're referring to US ACH. So essentially, that's not a mechanism that can be used to pay overseas suppliers.
So that would be what electronic checks or e-checks are for, is that right? They'd be, I don't know, maybe the international version of ACH?
It actually is exactly that. It's, so people refer to ACH, but that's US ACH. When they're referring to ACH overseas, they'll refer to it as an e-check or an electronic check or global ACH is kind of the term that's being used. But just as ACH is by far the most popular method in the US from both a finance or accounts payable perspective, but also from the supplier, it's absolutely the most preferred method to pay people overseas, the global ACH method, for many of the same reasons. The challenge here is that there's not actually a global ACH network that exists. So you have to work with either have to kind of create a bank-to-bank ACH transfers per each country, or you work with a partner like Topology that has their own proprietary network to pay various folks around the world in their local bank transfer.
Yeah, and the other payment types that came in, such as PayPal or e-wallet, they weren't nearly as popular.
Yeah, true. Everyone does know PayPal, but from a traditional accounts payable or B2B standpoint, it's not the most common or the most preferred method. The fees can be high. You have to draft in and out of the bank account. There's a separate point of management. It causes problems in a payment reconciliation perspective, and just not the most popular method in many countries in the world, and that just differs by region. But it is typically used, and what we see in our supplier base, it's used for low dollar amounts, and it's specifically popular in certain business models. So digital economy companies like online markets or virtual goods or crowdsourcing, maybe kind of outsource skill talent, share economy, ad networks and digital media companies or monetization companies, those folks, their supplier base tends to be more interested in using a payment method like PayPal. And so it's one of the options you want to make available, but just because of the nature of PayPal, it tends to be better only for smaller dollar payments. Some of the other methods in your prepaid debit card, PayPal generally isn't immensely popular for B2B payment, but in some countries that don't have a banking infrastructure, it can have value. So it could be something to consider. The reality is that there are so many different payment methods, preferences across countries and industries, and other kind of groups of companies that most AP departments simply don't have the means to handle all these different payment methods. Because it's time consuming and it adds some complexity, if you can provide a diverse array of payment methods, it definitely can, again, to more electronic payment methods which help reduce fraud risk, while definitely satisfying your supplier base in the U.S. and globally in a better way. The key is you want a combination of both. You want to handle a diversity of payment methods, but you certainly want to run it all efficiently so it doesn't add more complexity and workload to your finance team. That's the ideal state I think companies are shooting for.
Yeah, so with regards to remit payments, we asked the audience, how much time per week does your organization spend remitting payments to suppliers? And I think this illustrates the dilemma to a T. Nearly 45% say that it takes more than 6 hours a week.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we go back to that example I gave before about that kind of $80,000 salary, that's kind of basically the equivalent of about $11,000 a year just to write checks and send wires and make payments, and that doesn't even consider the time or the cost benefit of applying best practices to reduce payment error, fraud, tax and regulatory compliance, payment reconciliation reporting.
Yeah, so does it surprise you, Rob, that if we go back to the time spent on onboarding, that seems to be the inverse to the time spent making payments?
It does initially, but actually once you think through it, it doesn't actually. So when you do onboarding properly, it actually saves time from the payment remittance things. That's why it's so important to get that vendor record set up front, actually validate proactively the vendor record through that kind of supplier portal self-service onboarding model we talked about earlier. Essentially, you're asking the supplier to provide their own payment details. They know best they want to get paid. They know best their account information. They know best that if they enter the data wrong, they're not going to get paid. And so putting the onus on them for payability is the key. And if you can handle that right, your time spent on the actual remittance will go down significantly. And certainly it also reduces payment errors and fraud risk and hunting down and resolving payment issues and the such like that.
Okay, so we wanted to look more in detail around the complexity of the payment methods and their effect on the time spent paying, and so we added this analysis. So as you can see, those with greater propensity to use multiple payment methods, that really drove up their time spent.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense as mentioned, as you have global payment methods and you want to work with suppliers outside of the U.S., it definitely adds work and hardship associated with kind of operating and running multiple payment methods. So the benefits are definitely significant, but you do want to think proactively about how do you handle this efficiently as you grow.
So in talking about global remittance, we wanted to see where people were paying and where they were anticipating paying. So taking a look at this graph, clearly there's a major shift going on from domestic to international payments, especially to emerging regions that are traditionally less developed, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Africa. Why is this?
I think, firstly, the developing world and kind of all the globalization talk going on, it's where all the growth and supplier relationships are happening. It's a major trend in the finance and supply chain fields in general. Obviously, you have labor overseas that is more affordable, increasingly English-speaking and well-educated, and they're willing to do some jobs more cost-effectively as you require it for scale of your supply chain. To me, Asia really stands out in this data. It's going to be a dominating force in the future supply chain of the future. And, And I think there's also more work managing these suppliers and paying them.
How do you mean? What kind of work?
Well, of course, time zone, language differences, but also different payment rules and different payment preferences by the region. Let them select the payment method of their choice. Let them provide their own payment details again. And, of course, the payment itself should be optimized for their jurisdiction. If you don't check the different rules and requirements for payments in the jurisdiction, each different type of payment method in every single country has multitudes of different requirements by those different banking centers in each country. And so you really want to make sure you kind of, as you scale globally, you have an infrastructure in place where you can proactively kind of manage to this and make sure that you prevent payment errors from happening.
Are there additional business risks associated with the overseas suppliers because they might be more transient?
Yeah, there are. You're essentially sending money to another location, a person you likely don't know quite as well as if they were local, and that's where you need to have strong anti-money laundering compliance processes to make sure you're not paying the wrong people. If you pay drug traffickers, terrorist organizations, people on blacklists, cyber criminals, etc., the federal government is definitely coming down hard on that nowadays. The repercussions of that is not just like a slap on the hand or a fine anymore. It can be pretty severe. We've had customers actually come to us because their banks were shut down for paying someone on one of these AML or OFAC lists, and so the risk exposure is pretty large. We know, incidentally, from surveys that we've done in the past that about 2/3 of companies today are not compliant with OFAC laws, which is really scary, and there's real repercussions there. So it's definitely something people need to start looking at and build into their AP workflow.
Can you explain a little bit about OFAC, Rob? What does that stand for?
Oh, sure. So it stands for the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Essentially, there's the Treasury Department's administration enforcement arm, where it comes to blacklisting countries and individuals who illegally cannot be paid. Anyone doing so or paying those people can be marked as launderer or aiding in money laundering, and companies caught doing this have severe fines laid on them. They can have their banks shut down. It could actually lead to imprisonment in some cases, severe cases, of course. The repercussions are larger. AP departments should be checking every pay against that OFAC SDN, or kind of otherwise known as specially designated national list, and other blacklists before sending any payment. Right now, companies, generally in the data we've seen, are not doing this. So if you can't do it you should do it during onboarding ideally, but the more important place is to actually change it before every payment. And the reason is that this list is constantly changing. People are going on and off the list. And so you need to stay on top of those regulations if you're doing it manually, or use a system that's kind of on top of these various lists and is constantly up to date. But if you're doing checking on this before payment, you're much safer than otherwise.
Okay, well, on this next question, as we're talking about processes not often recognized as part of the accounts payable process, we looked into the area of tax compliance, which, if you remember, was the top concern by the respondents to the survey. This was very exposing. 43%, that's the top bar, collect tax forms at the end of the year, and 6% didn't even collect them.
Yeah, the 6% that don't even collect them is a really big mistake for those companies. The 43% collecting the tax forms at the end of the year is also a pretty big no-no nowadays. First, if you collect tax forms at the end of the year, you're potentially engaging a supplier at the very end of the cycle. They may not be in business anymore. They may not have a relationship anymore, and so they may not respond to you when you ask for that tax forms that you need to give to the IRS. There's also a risk that if you only collect a tax form at the end of the year, that means essentially for a year you've been paying out to a supplier that could have been a tax evader or a non-legal entity. Getting the tax form in the beginning of the process is a way of validating that you're paying legal folks. And so it's important you make this a part of your supplier onboarding process. Obviously with the risk exposure to the IRS, the other piece is FACTA. So we talked about FACTA a little earlier, the compliance tax regulations, and the IRS putting the onus on the payer to collect and validate the tax forms. And if you are not doing this, you're susceptible to a maximum of 30% maximum rate. What that means is instead of holding the payee accountable for that tax rate, they're just going to assume that you are susceptible to that 30% maximum tax rate, and the payer is now responsible for this. So that money can add up pretty fast. In some cases, there's also withholding requirements. So there's a $250 fine that hits a payer for each 1099 and 1042S that was not sent to suppliers. So there's a few other costs related to that.
Yeah, that's not insignificant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely best practice to collect and validate tax forms at the beginning of the process when you're setting up suppliers. It is one more step to do, but the risks of not doing it nowadays is too strong to avoid.
So let's sum up, if you don't mind, Rob. I'm going to go through some of the observations that really sprang out to us from the survey. The highest priority that we heard among the finance executives was staying compliant with the tax and regulatory requirements and streamlining the supplier payment processes. They made their payments in a variety of forms, a lot of different methods. The time spent onboarding can really add up. 62% of the people we heard from spent more than an hour a week onboarding each new payee. 22% reported in excess of 4 hours a week. And most of this was done very manually or by email or by direct contact, very labor intensive. Remitting payments took a lot of time. Almost half, 45% of those surveyed said they spend more than 6 man-hours per week making supplier payments. Payments today, it's a global world. The payments are taking place worldwide. 98% of the respondents' organizations send the payments to North American suppliers, but many also pay suppliers around the world, with a growth in payment activity going to Asia, Latin America, Middle East, and Africa. And there are a lot of different tax form collection methods. Responders to the survey report that collecting tax information by email, that was about 43%, and 6% do not even regularly collect them, and 51% use software as their tax collection method. And then the final conclusions, if you will. Based on these results, companies have a bunch of key areas to examine in their own cases. They should look at the added complexity of the payments and how that increases time and effort. When they're looking to grow and scale the organizations, they really need to hire either more AP sources or adopt a technology to improve the productivity of this process. Tax and regulation compliance is a very increasing concern. You have to factor this into the supplier payment process moving forward. Companies, even the companies with basic automation, they are exposed to risk, and they should always be looking at how to reduce that risk and make supplier payments less of a cost center. And ultimately, you have to take a more holistic approach to managing the supplier payments, how to streamline the activity, reduce friction, and improve compliance.
Thanks, Doug. Really interesting study and interesting conclusions. I'll add a few extra thoughts here, but I think it's clear that there's some real issues in today's manual processes for paying suppliers. Automating some of those processes is a key tool to eliminate some of those issues. You can put your business at risk if you take on more suppliers and go more global without being able to pay them effectively or efficiently. Dissatisfied suppliers will lead to a loss of top quality partners and ultimately hurt your firm's own competitiveness. That's from a supplier perspective and the relationship there and your ability to differentiate your service. with a strong supplier base. There's also issues with poor payment processes that lead to risk exposure. Payment errors add up fast from a cost perspective. They waste a lot of time. They create a very unideal or damaged supplier experience. And then there's fraud. Fraud's a risk that has to be thought of proactively with better controls in place to minimize loss. That can be significant. And once you send money out, if you pay someone you shouldn't have, you're probably not going to get that money back. And then you start looking at tax and regulatory requirements and the penalties being levied on companies who are not following these procedures, and they're really too large for your AP and finance departments to ignore. So I think right now, I think the data is kind of showing us companies do need to step up their game around managing the accounts payable and supplier payments operation, and to proactively eliminate business risk. And probably the best answer is not just to throw more bodies at the problem, but to invest in technology and ways to streamline your processes so that as you grow, you can grow efficiently. It's about resource allocation, and whether you want your finance team and your team in general focusing on helping your company grow and scale globally, or if you want them working on manual, repeatable processes. Obviously from a employee retention perspective, having your employees work on manual payments and minutia related to that is onboarding, but it's also prone to error and fraud. And finance in particular, it's a skill set where people are strong with the numbers, they understand how a business operates, and those folks are better off using their time to improve the company's cash flow, reporting, analysis, forecasting, working with business units to do budgeting more effectively and such. And that, I would argue, is a better way to deploy your talent as you keep growing. If you take it more simply, if you take an hour, would you rather have your folks on your team yourself chase down that vendor for their W-9, W-8 forms, or log into a bank portal and enter payment data in there to wire each fund to each of your 50 suppliers? Or would you rather work on something that helps the business perform better, such as optimizing your financial management system and processes? So I think that'll be the last I say for the day. So let's see what questions we have. Okay, so here's one question here. How does Tipalti pay in so many different payment methods? So essentially, we are PayPal for B2B payments. So we go through the same regulations, and we're a regulated financial institution, and we've got partnerships with blue chip banks. What that allows us to do is to handle about 6 different payment methods all through that same bank portal. And the beauty of that is you can pay your suppliers in a wide variety, over 100 currencies, 6 different payment methods. You can even do things like set payment thresholds. But because you have all of those payments going out of one system, you have instant visibility into that remittance. It makes for perfect payment reconciliation reporting where the data is proactively normalized. And that's essentially how we do what we do there. The similar question here, but just focused on international, but how does Tipalti support currency conversion to remit international suppliers? Similarly, from the payment method perspective, we talked about global ACH a little earlier, or e-check. So through those same banking partnerships and our relationships with different financial institutions, we're able to remit in over 100 countries, 190 countries, around the world, and in about over 120 currencies. And so you use our same system to remit to your U.S. suppliers as you do to international suppliers anywhere in the world, and those same range of different payment methods. And of course, in there is we do enable currency conversion, as the question asked. Good question here. How many payments do I need to reach to make automation worthwhile? And it is a good question. I think I mentioned a little earlier that very small businesses, they can probably usually handle the volumes they're getting. If they're getting 20 payments a month and the such, that's manageable. Usually in our experience, once companies start approaching 100 payments a month to suppliers and beyond, a lot of our customers are doing 300, 500, 1,000 supplier payments a month. At that point, the pain starts getting significant. The other thing to consider about it is, do you have plans in your business to grow? And if you have plans to grow your supplier base and your number of monthly payments are probably going to grow generally proportional to that growth. And so if you have 100 payments a month, but you know next year it's going to be 200, next year it's going to be 500, many companies come to us at that point where they're starting to already feel pain and they know this isn't a good way to spend their current team time, but they want to get ahead of it so that they don't have to hire more finance people to throw on the task. They can hire finance people when they need it from a business perspective and automate it, the global payments and the increased payment volume as they grow. So those are the indications of when automation is about the right time. If you're only having 30 payments a month at this point, that probably, I think it's probably too early to look into automation. Start approaching 100 and as you anticipate future growth for sure, and maybe global supplier growth as well, it's definitely the time to start looking at automation solutions. And again, look at the process comprehensively. Don't just look at it as remittance, but think of all the fraud, the tax compliance risk, supplier onboarding, payment reconciliation, and such. It would be my guidance. A question here about how does Tipalti manage fraud, tax, and regulatory compliance risk. So on this front, we've taken a lot of different approaches. We've got pretty built-out financial controls through the system. On the tax compliance front, we partner with KPMG, who certified our solution to be FACTA compliant. So they partnered one-to-one with us to make sure that we have actually a questionnaire wizard that helps the supplier provide the right tax form to us, and then they gave us logic to validate, to digitize and validate the tax information, and then of course handle withholding, 1099, 1042S processes. So that's how we handle it from a tax compliance perspective. From an AML checking or OFAC checking perspective, we check at supplier onboarding as well as at and before every payment against the OFAC list as well as other international watch lists. So we do that proactively. And then if we see a hit, so to speak, like a potential risk for an AML error, we actually proactively communicate to the payer that, hey, we think there might be some risk here. Do you want to proceed? Do you want to gather more information and such? So we help you through that process. That way the red flag doesn't go up too late once payment's already made. Other kind of financial controls we have, invoice and payment approval workflows, signatory rights, role-based views and access controls. We have audit trails by the payer as well as for the supplier, so the users and the supplier, from the finance end as well as from the vendor end. Payment reconciliation, AP reporting. So it's a really rich system. Companies like Twitter, Eventbrite, GoDaddy, and a number of other large organizations use us. And one of the reasons that they really like us is because of that tax compliance and the fraud protection and the financial control. So it is really enterprise grade from that perspective. One more question here. I think we have just enough time for a few more, but here's one more. When I pay with Tipalti, does my supplier see it coming from you or from me? So our perspective is that we want to put the finance organization and our clients front and center with their suppliers. It's all about improving that supplier relationship, while doing it efficiently. And so your brand is front and center. And so while we handle all these processes for you, everything's white labeled. So the supplier onboarding, for example, that we talked about earlier, that self-service supplier onboarding, it's actually either built within your website as an iframe, or it might be hosted by Tipalti, but it has your brand and your look and feel on it. Similarly, if we have communications about payment status, those come from emails from you with your branding on it, but it's actually Tipalti sending it on your behalf. So it's a very strong experience from a supplier perspective, and Tipalti is pretty much hidden in the background, but we're making everything easy for you while delivering a nice experience for your suppliers. Let's see. It looks like that's the last question of the day. So thank you guys very much. Doug, I want to thank you for joining us and for running the study.
Thank you, Rob. My pleasure. And thank you for everyone for joining today.
Great. That's it, everyone. Thanks for attending. If you have any feedback on today's webinar, we'd love to hear it so we can keep improving. Again, sorry for the technicalities earlier on, but it looks like we made through it, so that's great. And if you're interested in speaking with Tipalti, you can send an email to communications@tipalti.com or go to our website. So long, and thanks for your time.